Life Stories invites you to subscribe to our channel and begin today's tale, a heartfelt journey set against the vibrant streets of Chicago. Meet Haley, a committed art teacher juggling tight budgets and big dreams, and Ethan, a driven CEO grappling with the weight of his father's corporate legacy. Their worlds first collide at a wedding in a single dance that sparks hope, doubt, and ultimately a profound connection. Through moments of honesty and lessons from the past, they discover that love can defy boundaries. Subscribe to Life Stories now, and let's embark on this transformative adventure together. I remember the first time I ever saw Ethan Palmer. The November air in Chicago was chilly, and I'd just slipped into a borrowed yellow dress that felt far too bright for my taste and far too thin for that weather. Yet there I was, standing in the foyer of one of the most prestigious hotels in the city, fighting the urge to tug the hemline down another inch or two. At the time, I was only focused on being a bridesmaid for my dear friend Madison, who had insisted I wear that color, despite my endless protests about how it clashed with my hair and my pale complexion. But honestly, Madison had done so much for me growing up that I couldn't refuse. She'd been there when I needed someone to vent to about the public school where I taught art classes, or whenever I was exhausted from my weekend waitress shifts. At the school, I was used to making do with limited paintbrushes and patchy canvases. In the restaurant, I was used to trays of canapes and stiff smiles. My entire life seemed woven from one compromise after another. Yet I believed I was making a difference, especially for my students, who hung on to any small opportunity to nurture their budding creativity. Even so, none of that prepared me for the evening that was about to unfold. I'd taken exactly 3 steps into the grand ballroom, its chandeliers glittering above well-dressed guests, when I spotted Ethan. He stood near the bar, glass in hand, shoulders squared in an elegant yet distant sort of way. He looked slightly bored and entirely too polished for my comfort. I had assumed he was just another wealthy guest connected to Madison's new in-laws, but something in the set of his jaw or the tired look in his eyes sparked my curiosity. Our introduction was comically abrupt. Madison's mother, flamboyant and meddlesome, found me fretting over the correct way to hold my bouquet for the upcoming wedding photos. She swept me across the ballroom, straight to Ethan, who turned out to be the groom's older brother. Suddenly, I was exchanging pleasantries with someone who, judging by his tailored suit, probably never had to worry about paying rent in installments. I kept thinking how unfair it was that I'd been forced into an awkward conversation with a man who was clearly more at home discussing business deals than trying to decipher my passion for art. Then the music started. With a swift nudge, Madison's mother propelled me forward, leaving me with no choice but to place my hand in Ethan's and step onto the dance floor. At first, we both seemed painfully aware of our respective roles. Me in my thrifty gown and slightly scuffed shoes, him in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly paycheck. But then we found ourselves moving in tandem, awkwardly at first, until we fell into an easy rhythm. He asked polite questions about my work, my students. Surprised by his genuine interest, I told him how I used my own funds to buy art supplies, how I sometimes worked double shifts so I could afford to give my kids better materials. To my astonishment, he didn't recoil. He looked at me with something close to admiration, as if he'd never expected this kind of world to exist. We swayed beneath the chandelier, the lively chatter of wedding guests fading into the background. I realized that, for a moment, neither of us felt out of place anymore. It was just 2 people trying to understand each other over the course of one unexpected dance. And in that one dance, something unlocked inside me. I had no idea how much that brief connection would someday change my life. But change it, it did. If someone had told me I'd agree to see Ethan Palmer again after that wedding, I might have laughed in disbelief. I was convinced we came from 2 different planets, his orbit filled with boardrooms and power deals, mine anchored by paint-stained desks and children's laughter. Yet the very next evening, a small, unmarked envelope arrived at my apartment. Inside was a simple note, his neat handwriting striking me as both careful and determined. I enjoyed our dance. Could we continue the conversation over coffee, E? Despite my initial doubt, I wrote back, partly out of curiosity, and partly because the memory of those few minutes we'd shared on the dance floor refused to fade. We met at a quiet cafe that smelled of roasted beans and fresh pastries. I remember feeling a rush of self-consciousness, checking my reflection in the frosted glass window before stepping inside. Ethan was already there, dressed less formally, yet still exuding an air of effortless confidence. The difference was that he looked nervous. There was no trace of that polished facade from the wedding. He stood when I approached, even pulled out my chair, small gestures that felt charmingly old-fashioned. We launched into a conversation that spanned hours. I told him about my dad, Mark Reeves, who'd lost his job in a corporate buyout when I was younger. That had forced my family into a financial struggle we barely escaped. Ethan listened with genuine interest, occasionally leaning forward, elbows on the table. His questions never felt prying, just carefully curious, as though he was unaccustomed to hearing about life so far outside his privileged circle. At one point, he offered a quiet confession. "I've never met anyone who teaches, not the way you do. I just thought schools provided all the supplies needed." He paused, taking in my wry smile. I guess I was wrong. There was no pity in his voice, just a dawning realization that the reality I lived was alien to him. After that afternoon, something between us shifted. We started texting, sharing snippets of our worlds. I sent him photos of my students' art projects. He described the high-rise office he rarely left before 10 at night. We carved out a pocket of mutual fascination, learning piece by piece. Then the unthinkable happened. I discovered that Ethan was the son of Arthur Palmer, the man who headed Palmer Enterprises, the very corporation that had orchestrated that ruinous buyout years ago, the one that shattered my father's career. I stumbled on it by pure accident, noticing the same last name linked to old newspaper articles. My heart dropped as I realized the devastating scope of the coincidence. When I confronted Ethan about it, trembling with disbelief, I could see the horror spread across his face. He hadn't known at first, so he claimed. But sometime along the line, he'd found out who I was and simply couldn't bring himself to tell me. My childhood memories of my father's defeated face clashed violently with my new feelings for this man in front of me. And just like that, the fragile bridge we'd started to build threatened to crumble beneath our feet. I thought I'd never speak to Ethan again after the truth about his family came to light. For a few days, anger consumed me. I replayed every conversation, every warm moment, wondering if it was all just a trick. Even when he texted or called, I refused to answer. My father had deserved better, and quite frankly, so did I. But then, in the midst of my pain, something happened that made me stop in my tracks. A delivery arrived at my school, boxes upon boxes of brand new art supplies, paint, brushes, canvases, enough to last an entire year. There was no note attached, just a modest label reading, "Donation for the Arts." At first, I questioned whether accepting them was even right, but my students' excited faces melted my hesitation. Watching them open those boxes was like witnessing the sun break through a storm. They no longer had to ration paint or share a single brush between 4 kids. Suddenly, they could explore their creativity fully. I knew exactly who was behind it. To confirm, I made a discreet call to the supply company. Sure enough, the payment originated from Palmer Enterprises. My first reaction was an overwhelming mix of gratitude and resentment. Yes, I was relieved beyond words to have resources for my classroom, but I also worried, was it just a gesture of atonement rather than genuine remorse? A few days later, my mother, whose heart had hardened over the years since losing my father, called me with a trembling voice. "He came by to see me," she said. "He found your father's old pension records and paid me the money your dad was owed. He offered an apology, Haley. A real one." Suddenly, the walls I'd erected around my anger began to crack. Ethan had taken a personal step to confront his family's past, rather than simply writing a check. If it had been nothing more than strategy, he surely would have remained at a distance. Despite my own fear of being hurt again, I agreed to meet him at a small diner on the edge of the old neighborhood. When I arrived, he looked different, almost vulnerable. He spoke candidly about the files he had unearthed and the painful history he'd uncovered. He described tense meetings with corporate attorneys who balked at the idea of retroactive compensation and community repairs. Through it all, he had insisted on making things right, even if it put him at odds with parts of his own board. The sincerity in his eyes reminded me of the man I had glimpsed, first on that dance floor and then again across the table in the cafe. We talked for hours, moving beyond apologies into new possibilities: scholarships for students, infrastructure for the neighborhood, and a project he called the Reeves Community Arts Center. He wanted me directly involved in its design, trusting my instincts as a teacher and an artist. I won't pretend it was all smooth sailing after that. Healing takes time, especially when it involves such deeply rooted wounds. Yet as I stood beside Ethan, cutting the ribbon on the new Arts Center almost a year later, I understood a profound truth. What began as a fragile dance between two people from opposing worlds had grown into something stronger, a testament that empathy, love, and the willingness to right past wrongs can unite even the most unlikely of hearts. As the doors of the Reeves Community Arts Center closed one evening, Haley stood by the large mural her students had painted, a vivid explosion of color and creativity that perfectly captured her own journey with Ethan. Memories came rushing back: their first awkward dance at Madison's wedding, the stunned realization that his family's business had once ruined her father's life, and all the painful moments of doubt and anger that ensued. Despite everything, they had chosen to persevere and trust in what they saw in each other's eyes: a shared sense of hope, a longing to create something meaningful beyond the labels of wealth or hardship. Over time, Ethan's efforts to repair the damage left by his father's corporation began to bear fruit. The new arts center, filled with energetic children and curious adults alike, embodied the unity they had worked so hard to forge. Families from the neighborhood would visit for painting classes, weekend workshops, and community gatherings. In that bustling space, differences seemed smaller, grievances found pathways toward resolution, and art served as a bridge to bring people closer. Haley could scarcely believe how much her life had changed since that night she stumbled across Ethan at the wedding bar, wearing a dress she'd been certain was all wrong for her. And yet, it had led her here, to this moment of gratitude. She knew challenges still lay ahead. Growth always came with struggle. But in the gentle hum of new voices echoing in the corridors of the center, she heard the promise of a future unburdened by anger or regret. Thank you for experiencing Haley and Ethan's story, a tale of compassion, redemption, and the courage to heal. If you'd like to see more heartfelt stories and uplifting content, please subscribe to our channel, Life Stories, so you never miss our newest videos. We appreciate your support and can't wait to share more journeys with you.